thank you so much for taking the time out. And we're all really interested in listening from you. So just to give a quick introduction, Mrs. Charlie is currently working as a senior scientist and the lead developer at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And I believe he has a vast for over 30 years experience designing and managing of SEI's LEAP, that is a scenario-based modeling system for integrated energy policy, climate change mitigation, air pollution abatement planning. And Charlie is also really passionate about building capacity for sustainable energy planning, especially in the low and middle income countries. And he has actually worked for more than 50 countries, conducting workshops, undertaking energy studies, and providing training and assistance to the users of this LEAP. So thank you so much, Charlie. Just to give a quick, I won't be going into the details of LEAP. We'll leave it up to you. But yes, LEAP is currently has over more than 70,000 users worldwide, including the government agencies, energy utilities, national laboratories, academic institutes, and non-government organizations. And it has extensively been used as the analytical basis for climate mitigations plan developed by at least 64 countries. That is their national determined contribution. So before going to Charlie, also to kind of give him what Pakistan has done on LEAP, and especially what SDPI has contributed in that you're definitely aware that almost 2 to 3 years back, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, under their next step model, used LEAP as one of the tools for developing Pakistan's SDG 7 roadmap. And definitely LEAP was used as a modeling tool, and that was work was done by UNSCAP in collaboration with SDPI, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, and Private Power and Infrastructure Board that comes under the Ministry of Energy Power Division. Other than that, I believe have been Pakistan, but LEAP has also been used by Pakistan's Ministry of Planning Development Special Initiatives. They do have a specific department that works around it, Pakistan's Central Power and Purchasing Agency. Both of these departments are extensively utilizing the LEAP for developing these bottom-up models as well. And lastly, currently, Pakistan in the last year has been in the process of updating its nationally determined contributions and Pakistan's Global Climate Change, GCIAC, and the research arm of the Ministry of Climate Change that is also using LEAP for doing some of the modeling around Pakistan's nationally determined contributions, and especially the ones that are its updated NDCs. So we actually have, and other than that, a lot of these research institutions, academic institutions have actually used LEAP. SEPI itself has, since we're non-profit organizations, we actually also have published over like 6 to 7 detailed reports and roadmaps that used LEAP as one of the very key implementation software. So again, as far as Pakistan's policy climate and policy circle is considered, that's actually one of the most widely used tool that does exist. So now again, just to kind of driven by these, SDP actually has been doing these capacity building sessions and workshops each year. Each year we take almost 2 different cohorts that are last year it was all in person, but this time this cohort was conducted in a hybrid manner where we actually have and today is the initial starting date. We actually had it's kind of a 6 weeks long training program that has 6 different modules. Firstly, it is more about kind of informing them what energy modeling is, what different tools are, what methodological approaches are. And then over the next 5 weeks, we'll be going down into different developing the trees, developing demand side models, developing supply side model, and towards the very end, a bit towards the optimization end as well. So the participants we have for the sessions, particularly, they're either the early careers youngsters that are coming into the space of energy modeling, but at the same time, we also have a lot of government representatives, public sector organizations whose individuals are a part of this training program. So the first session that we actually had was happened in the very early morning because that was in a hybrid mode. So it was almost roughly around like from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. in the morning, where we kind of started with the energy planning process. But this lecture with you, it's kind of a special lecture that we kind of engaged where we actually had more people than not only the ones that were registered for this cohort. So we kind of tried to bring in more people who are working in the energy modeling space, working in the energy space, just to kind of listen from a view of what is exactly the story behind the leap that's been going on. So thank you so much for again giving us your time. And I believe we'll be having a lot of these different questions as we go along. We have also kind of compiled an FAQ based on our today's earlier session and the last some of the queries that have been constantly coming up from the last cohorts. But firstly, I believe your perspective and what you have to say around the leap, and from there we'll So thank you so much once again, Charlie, for joining us. And with this, I believe it's over to you.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfect.
Great. Okay. And hi everyone. Thanks for staying late this evening to listen to me. I appreciate you adjusting for my time. I'm going to try and share a screen now. Let's see what happens. Seem to be working.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone. So I'll go through some slides here. I think I've got about half an hour. Is that right, Obaid?
Yes, exactly.
Great. Okay, I'll go through some slides. Please do post. I probably won't be able to see your questions as you're posting them, but please do the post questions. And we'll try to get to those. Either we'll respond to them in person, or we can do it in the chat later on. So I've just got a few introductory slides about modeling and a few introductory slides about LEAP. I'm not quite sure what you've already covered today, but so apologies if I'm going to tell you stuff that you've already heard today, but there we are. So just a few slides on the role of models in planning. Some of these slides are a bit more about climate mitigation planning, but I think they also apply generally to the concept of energy planning, thinking about clean energy planning as well. So so first of all, what are the challenges in long-term planning? So planning is really about confronting uncertainty, and there's not only a huge amount of uncertainty, but I think there's more uncertainty today than there's ever been, which probably means that planning is more important than it's ever been. There's uncertainty about the driving, the drivers, but I mean things like internal, external factors. What's going to happen with oil prices, what's going to happen with population growth, what's going to happen with external trade conditions, something everyone's thinking about at the moment due to a certain person that we won't mention. And also an uncertain science as well, and uncertain conditions about the future. And obviously climate is the big thing there, but there's many other issues we're addressing as well. So there's environmental challenges, there's development challenges, but there's also uncertainty about what are the priorities of the society that you care about. There's no one answer that's correct. Energy planning is about responding to the needs and the wishes of the society that you live in. But it's also about opportunities. So, despite these uncertainties, planners can have a big influence, and the influence is greatest over the long term. Short-term outcomes are probably somewhat already determined by, the systems that you've already built, the energy systems that have already been created. But planners can have a big impact on shaping long-term outcomes. And conditioning what the markets and what the systems will look like in the future. So if you build bad systems now, you're going to have to live with them for a long time. But if you build systems that work well for society, you can have good beneficial outcomes. So what's the role of models in that? So models can help decision makers understand how systems may evolve into the future, so they can be a forward-looking thing that lets you look at what the future might look like if you don't make policy changes, and they can help you think about these external factors. So I mentioned them already. Prices, what's going to happen with global climate action, what's going to be the global trade conditions, but also internal factors. You know, how is the economy going to develop? What's happening with population growth, urbanization? What sort of policy choices are likely to be made? And they can help you answer a range of questions. You know, you can think about how energy is currently being consumed and produced. And you can look in particular about sort of where do you have good information and where do you have bad information. And a lot of planning isn't just about making decisions. It's about working out what you do and don't know and working out how you can improve that. You know, there's that old cliche about you can't manage what you don't measure, which comes up a lot in planning. We use that cliche a lot, but it's very true. You know, if you don't have very good data about the systems, then you're not going to be able to make very good decisions about it. You can think about, you know, future. You can think about sort of your future energy requirements and your future emissions, not just of greenhouse gases, but also, you know, especially in Asia, local air pollution is a huge issue, and it has huge impacts, and that might be something you want to think about improving in the future. And then you can think about policies. You can think about what level of greenhouse gas mitigation can be achieved in the future. To what extent can you improve conditions with air pollution? To what extent can you address, you know, societal needs? For example, providing clean energy to people who are very underserved. You know, energy is absolutely crucial for development. So planning energy well is one of the best ways of contributing towards the development of a country. And maybe it's important to say that models can't provide definitive answers. You know, models, even though models are optimizing models and they can do sort of least cost optimization, that isn't the only thing you care about. So models aren't really there to tell you what you should be doing. Models are there to help facilitate conversations among stakeholders. And different stakeholders will have different valid perspectives. Different groups will care about different topics more or less. You know, those what people care about changes over time. You know, at the moment you're seeing in Europe, there's a bit of a shift away from caring so much about sort of climate change, which maybe is a mistake, and but there's more of a shift to thinking about national security, and that quite often also includes energy security. So, you know, there's models can help give you information about those things, and they can help facilitate conversations among different groups that maybe have different priorities, but they're not there to tell you exactly what the right answer is. But I think the other really crucial role of models is that they can help you have those conversations and make those decisions based on the best available science. You know, so if that's maybe the most crucial role, you know, even though they don't know the right answers, they can tell you whether stuff adds up properly, and they can tell you whether you're doing stuff based on good available science, and that's really crucial, especially for sort of climate change. So there's different types of models available. I won't go into these in great detail, but they basically sort of fall into sort of two main groups. There's sort of the top-down, more economic-based models, and then there's sort of the bottom-up, more sort of engineering-type models. So the top-down models tend to be based on sort of observations of how energy systems behave in relation to other sort of high-level macroeconomic variables. So typically, you're sort of observing historically, you know, how has the energy system evolved as your economic structure has evolved. So you're looking at sort of variables like GDP, prices, sort of the economic structures, and how has that been related to energy use in the past. And they quite often, those sort of high-level models I use more as a sort of forecasting tool. They're used to sort of forecast what we think the system might be in the future. But they're not especially good for thinking about sort of detailed technological questions. You know, what can we really achieve if we do energy efficiency policy, or what's the potential for renewable energy? Those kinds of questions. The reason they're not useful for that is they don't really have the detail to describe those sort of actual sort of engineering aspects of an energy system, but they can be very useful for thinking about sort of high level sort of fiscal issues, you know, like what's the right level of a carbon tax or a pollution tax. You know, they can guide those sorts of questions, but they don't tend to be used so much in sort of climate planning and sort of detailed energy planning, because they don't really get into the details of that. So then there's the more sort of like bottom-up type models. And those focus much more on the technologies, and they look at, what could potentially provide the energy services that society needs. So typically they start by thinking about sort of those overall societal needs for energy. So what's going on in the household sector? How much energy do people need for cooking? How much do they need for heating? How much do they need for lighting, air conditioning, those kinds of things? And you start from there, and then you sort of work your way back. Sorry, excuse me. You work your way back, and you think about sort of what kind of technologies are available. What do those technologies cost? What fuels do they use? What's the emissions associated with them? So that's more the kind of sort of engineering perspective, and that's more the sort of school of thinking that sort of LEAP and other models come from, that sort of bottom-up perspective. And there's sort of, traditionally, we've talked about sort of 3 different types of models, sort of focusing on their sort of solution algorithms. So there's sort of optimization models, which strive to sort of look across all the different potential technologies and essentially work out what's the least cost way of providing the energy services you need. So that's sort of the optimization approach. And most models, I would say today, probably follow that approach to a large extent. You've probably heard of some of them. There's Times, which is very well known, Balmoral, which is more sort of focused on sort of heating systems and cooling systems. There's Plexos, which is a very sophisticated and very expensive model for doing energy planning. Message is another well-known one that the IAEA and other groups have used. And then there's LEAP, which is one that we provide. Then there's other approaches as well, and some of these are a bit simpler. Simulation models, which actually sort of look more, not so much at sort of what's the optimal way of a system being configured, but it's more of a simulation of how consumers and producers behave under different signals. So, if the price goes up, how do consumers change their consumption patterns, or how do producers respond if there's sort of a higher electricity price? Do they build more power plants, that kind of thing? That approach has not been so prevalent, in part, I think, because it can be a bit sort of hard to justify the algorithms. They tend to be sort of different in every country, and it's hard to sort of have a generic model that works well across lots of countries. But certainly people do build those kinds of models. LEAP can do some of that kind of stuff. There's another model that was around for a long time. It's not really used so much anymore, called Balance, that has that approach. And then the third kind is just sort of accounting tools, which are really basically just trying to give a tool to users to describe what an energy system looks like, and to do all of the accounting of consumption and production and emissions, and to help users sort of tell a story about it. And LEAP has traditionally sort of come out of that school of thinking as well. But there's another one called GASMO or GACMO, which is a popular tool that the UN helps countries use for climate mitigation modeling. And those tend to be sort of simpler models, more sort of spreadsheet type tools. And you can see that the LEAP's listed underneath all of them. And in part, many of these models are sort of coming together at this point. They're not differentiated so much by the algorithms they support. They're differentiated more by sort of the user experience, and just the big difference between the models is really sort of how difficult they are to use, and what's involved in using them. And I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. So let me just say a little bit about modeling and scenario analysis. Probably got a few too many slides here. I might skip over some of them. So what are scenarios? So scenarios are really just sort of telling, it's basically telling a story about how the future might evolve. And you can tell those stories in words, you can tell it in numbers. And typically in LEAP is sort of trying to give you a tool to tell a story about what might be a sort of a plausible future, and how it might evolve over time under different assumptions about what's going on in the world. So scenarios can be used to explore alternative external factors. So you can that's essentially doing sort of sensitivity analysis, but you can also use it to do policy analysis, to explore the pros and cons of alternative policy choices. And and that, you know, one way of using them is also to explore many different futures and to see, you know, not just looking at one optimal future, but to think about, you know, what might be sort of robust and resilient futures. So that's traditionally been one of the problems of optimization modeling, that people have tended to say, you know, this is the least cost scenario, this is what you should do. But you know, a scenario that's optimal under one external set of constraints might be very suboptimal on another. You know, you might choose, you might assume that you're going to have low oil prices in the future and work out what's the optimal conditions for your energy system under that assumption. But if you have a high oil prices, that might be a, you know, a very suboptimal scenario. So increasingly, people are doing more of what's called a sort of like robust or resilient planning, which tries to look at sort of lots of different external conditions and work out what's the optimal things, the optimal conditions under those different sets of conditions. So you're trying to sort of find policies that work well, you know, under different sets of external conditions. So something's more robust, resilient. And there's various techniques for doing that. For example, Monte Carlo analysis is one approach that actually sort of helps you sort of automate that and do it in a more systematic way. Like Monte Carlo analysis, for example, is not built into Leap, but you can use Leap with external tools that help you do Monte Carlo analysis. Essentially, what it's doing is letting you systematic way. Like Monte Carlo analysis, for example, you can use Leap with analysis. Essentially, your sort of the probability distributions of the outcomes and see which things are sort of robust. So let me just mention, you know, a difference between sort of different types of scenarios. So typically, most people doing scenario analysis will do at least two, usually a baseline scenario and usually one or more. Typically, you do many policy scenarios. So a baseline scenario is typically a scenario that looks at what's likely to happen in the future in the absence of new policies or actions that are being considered. So it's kind of a counterfactual or a baseline, and it's really useful to do that so that then once you do your policy analysis, you can compare, you know, how much emissions have you reduced versus a baseline, or how much does it cost versus a baseline, or what are the different energy security conditions versus a baseline. And increasingly, that's sort of the way the world is sort of framing and thinking about doing sort of mitigation scenarios. So, you know, we've typically, like under the UNFCCC, when people are doing their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, they're sort of submitting plans, and they're sort of showing to the world how these plans are going to reduce emissions relative to not doing those plans, so relative to a baseline scenario. So, and Leap is kind of set up to help you do that. You know, you can create all sorts of different scenarios, but it's very set up to help you look at different scenarios and the benefits of those different scenarios. And when you're doing those scenarios, it's very important to frame them. I'll just say a quick bit about this. So particularly for climate modeling, you need to sort of frame what's included and what's not included in your scenario. So you frame sort of the scope of your analysis. So are you just going to look at CO2? Are you going to look at all greenhouse gases? Are you going to look at local air pollutants? You know, what sectors are you going to include? You know, most people use Leap to do sort of energy system modeling for, say, a whole country or a whole city. But you could just look at transport sector if you want to, or you can just focus in on one particular sector, like sort of land use and agriculture. It's also important to think about the accounting basis. So, like, there is certain set ways of accounting for emissions. For example, under the UNFCCC, when countries submit their plans, they use what's called a territorial accounting. So that's basically set rules for what emissions count against your country. So, for example, you know, if you're burning coal in Pakistan, those emissions count as Pakistan's emissions. If Saudi Arabia is producing oil, but it exports the oil and it's burnt in another country, those emissions count against the country that's burning the oil. They don't count against Saudi Arabia's sort of emissions account. So there's a certain sort of set agreed way of doing that. but there are also alternative ways of doing it. And increasingly, for example, in a lot of environmentalists think we should be thinking more, accounting on a consumption basis. So, there's a big issue, for example, in the West at the moment where emissions appear to be going down. Some of the decrease, though, is due to the fact that a lot of the products being consumed in the West are actually being produced in other regions. So, for example, some people say that maybe up to 20% of China's territorial emissions are actually producing products that are then consumed in other countries. So should they be counted against China? Should they be counted against the rich countries that are consuming those products? It's quite controversial, but quite interesting. And then also you want to think about the time frame. You can do short-term, long-term analysis. LEAP is most useful, I think, for sort of medium to long-term analysis, for thinking about what are the sort of long-term trends and planning for those long-term trends. It's not so much useful for looking at sort of daily dispatch of power plants. There's other tools that are much more detailed for that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm going to skip this one. It's a bit too detailed. So just to sum up on modeling then, modeling is sort of one part of the planning process, and quite often it's thought of as being a sort of separate task. But I think it's more useful to think of modeling as being a sort of an overall tool for guiding the overall planning process. So it can sort of help to guide and manage the overall process. So, for example, it can help you work out where you need to improve data. It can help inform policies, but also there's a feedback. It can also help you sort of monitor whether you're achieving those policies. So it really is something that sort of can be useful throughout the whole cycle of a planning process, or at least it ought to be. It doesn't always, that's not always what happens, but I think sort of the ideal is that it should be used more as a sort of control panel for guiding an overall planning process. And maybe not the least of the important parts of that is actually using modeling as an engagement tool. So, the feedback that you get from, setting the plans in the first place, which is more of a technical question, to actually then engaging with your stakeholders and actually helping people decide whether they like the plans you've come up with or not. So that's an incredibly important part of the process. And that, I think, is where I want to come on to now with what we've done with LEAP. And that's where models are actually quite different. Some models are very technical, they're very capable, but they're not very good as engagement tools. Whereas LEAP is something that I hope I'm going to show you in the next few slides, is something that's much more about that sort of aspect of it. It's not just about modeling, but it's about helping people to engage with the results of modeling. So I'm going to come on and do a few slides now about LEAP. I hope I'm doing okay for time. I've got about another 15 minutes. Is that right? Wait, yeah, okay. So what is LEAP? So LEAP is, so maybe first thing to say, LEAP is not a model. LEAP is not a model of a particular system. LEAP is a tool for building models of particular systems. So it's a Windows-based tool for energy planning, greenhouse gas mitigation assessment, and also local air pollution planning as well. It's something that's been developed over a very long period now. Yeah, I think you had an early slide that said I was the founder of it. That's not true. It actually goes back even further than me, even though I might look quite old. It's even older than me. It's been around for 40 years. I've been working on it for 30 years, but it goes all the way back to about 1980. It's always been developed with sort of low and middle income countries in mind. So the very first version of LEAP was used in a project in Kenya that was thinking about wood fuel planning. But it's always been sort of the core audience of LEAP has always been planners in lower and middle income countries. That's the people we're trying to design for. It's at this point, it's been very widely applied. I think it's basically, there's users in every country. I don't know all of them, but I know many of them. At least 64 countries use LEAP to help develop the climate plans, the NDCs that were submitted to the UNFCCC, for example. But lots of countries also use it as part of their energy planning processes. And there's many thousands of active users. I've really sort of lost count at this point. Not everyone's using it at the national scale, although that's probably maybe like sort of 70% of the applications are at the national scale. But there's also a lot of people using it now at sort of municipal scale. In some places, it's being used for sort of multi-regional planning as well. Very good example of that is the ASEAN Centre for Energy, which sort of does integrated planning for the whole of the Southeast Asian region, and they develop an annual energy outlook that's published every year or every 2 years. So Leap is very much a scenario-based modeling tool. It's really about sort of telling stories about the future, and it can help explore how an energy system and how the emissions associated with the energy system are likely to change over time under alternative policies and measures. Leap is primarily focused on the energy sector. So I would say most of its capabilities are related to modeling the energy sector, but you can also use it for looking at non-energy sector emissions. So because of that, you can then use it to do sort of full accounting for emissions for a country across all sectors. And it's able to cover all pollutants, so not just greenhouse gases, but also short-lived climate pollutants, SLCPs, and local air pollutants. And it does also now have a component that takes the emissions and through a sort of simplified atmospheric geochemistry modeling process, it's able to give you an estimate of the sort of the air quality and the sort of the health impacts associated with those emissions. So you can actually sort of compare different scenarios and actually sort of compare, what's the impact in terms of avoided premature mortality, or so you can actually sort of literally see sort of the number of deaths that you can avoid with one scenario versus another in some level of detail. You can look by age group, you can look by disease, you can look by gender. So it gives you some kind of quite sort of concrete idea of what are sort of the health benefits of different scenarios. And I would say so increasingly over time, we're trying to build more of that kind of thing into Leap. And actually, you mentioned UNESCAP, Ubaid, and that's a group that's really interested in sort of using Leap to do sort of SDG planning, Sustainable Development Goal planning. So it's it's sort of grown out of sort of looking at the energy systems, but energy systems have a big impact on all sorts of aspects of society, whether it's sort of providing clean energy, which is really important for development, whether it's the health impacts of energy. Energy really cuts through everything. So it's quite valuable to think about how the energy system is going to impact on your development goals, your environment goals, those kinds of things. So increasingly we're sort of building those kinds of things into Leap. We've done stuff recently on, as I mentioned, with on health impacts of air pollution. We've just built in a new aspect that helps you look at the affordability of different scenarios. So it's one thing to think about whether a scenario is the optimal scenario in terms of costs, but you also need to dig a bit deeper and look at how different scenarios are going to impact on particular sort of communities. So particularly, you should probably want to be worrying about sort of poorer, more marginalized communities, and look at whether these scenarios can be made affordable for those communities. If they're not going to be affordable, probably they're not realistic scenarios. So those are some of the kind of things that you could do with Leap and that we've sort of gradually been building on over time. So yeah, what makes Leap different? So I think there's a few aspects that make it different from some of the other models. And I think first and foremost is it's designed for development. It really focuses, it starts by thinking about sort of the needs of populations in low and middle income countries. So the modeling is all sort of driven not just by, what's the optimal set of power plants to build, but it starts from the demand side and says, what's the needs of society, and what are different ways of meeting those needs, and how, what might be different policies and measures we can put in place for meeting those needs. Partly because of that, it's sort of emerged as a system that's has quite a strong structure to it. And so it's ended up being quite sort of like didactic. It has this sort of like, I think partly because it's driven by sort of that need to think about society's needs first. So it has this sort of tree structure in it. And that's made it quite a useful tool for teaching and capacity building, which hopefully what you're doing this week illustrates that. And then I think thirdly is we've tried to design it as something that's not just for modelers. You know, it's a tool to be used by planners, and it's a tool to be used by planners who want to engage with stakeholders. So we've really put a lot of effort into LEAP, not just to work on the algorithms, but also sort of explaining the algorithms, you know, and so there's a lot of parts of LEAP are about sort of helping you manage data and bring data into the model. And there's a lot of parts of LEAP that are about helping you look at the results very, very easily, and then, you know, allow you to explain those results to your decision makers so they can look over your shoulder and say, you know, why is this number what it is? You know, LEAP helps you explain why the numbers are what they are. And probably the other thing that makes it different is it's just been around a long time at this point. So we've been working on it for 40 years. So you know, it has the benefit of having that sort of large investment of time. And it's become increasingly sophisticated over time. But we've always sort of tried to keep the design focused on the needs of that particular group of users I mentioned. So it's always been focused on the needs of the planning community in low and middle income countries. It's not intended to be a tool that's only usable by modelers. It's a tool that's intended to be usable by planners. And then you can see those pictures on the right. The other thing that makes it different is people. We've always been very sort of people oriented. We've always done a lot of capacity building work, and lots of people use LEAP, and we've got quite a vibrant community of people using it. And those people have a very strong voice in guiding the direction of LEAP, and we try to make sure that we follow their guidance, you know. And if people it's quite interesting when I work with my colleagues in the US and they're doing a very sophisticated analysis. At the end of the day, I always think, oh dear, LEAP isn't sophisticated enough. I need to add some new algorithms to it. And then when I go do a training workshop or I engage with people in the real world, I always think, oh my goodness, LEAP is still way too difficult. I need to work on making this thing easier. So it's nice to have those two voices. You know, it helps guide the direction of the tool. And so the result of all that is that it, you know, it's now pretty widely used around the world, and you know, we're really focused on the need to increase institutional capacity. And I would say, in general about the world, that you know, we've only really scratched the surface of the needs, and I'm really sort of excited to hear about the work that you're doing there in Pakistan. And there is, you know, such a pressing need to build a new cadre of young planning experts, because there's so much to do. The problems are so big, but there's potential to really make some very beneficial changes. So I'm so happy to see that you're working on these kinds of issues this week and beyond. How am I doing? I'm rapidly running out of time here, aren't I? Let me just say a little bit of in practice about the structure of LEAP. I won't go into this in general. Maybe you've already covered this today, I'm not sure. But this is the basic structure of the sort of calculations in LEAP. It's, as I say, it's mainly demand driven. So you start by thinking about, what does society look like? You know, what are the economic conditions? What are the needs of society? So that's very much under the demand analysis. That's where you think about, you know, like what do the different sectors look like? You know, households, industry, transport, services. What are their needs for energy now, and what are their needs going to be in the future? Under transformation analysis, you then can think about how you're going to meet those needs. So there you're thinking about all the sectors that sort of produce energy or convert energy from one form to another. So there you're thinking about sectors like electricity generation, oil refining. You might be thinking about sort of things that might come along in the future. So, for example, hydrogen might be a thing in the future, might not be a thing. It's a bit sort of open to question. But so transformation is thinking about those kinds of things. Then sort of ultimately you end up thinking about the resources you're going to need. So that's thinking about, you know, how much fossil fuels are we going to be using in the future? What's the potential for renewable energy? And you know, how much that is going to be produced within the country, how much can be imported, what might be exports. So you're building up sort of essentially the energy balance for your country today, but think about what those energy balances might look like in the future. And then sort of like hanging off the side, you've got sort of the cost benefit analysis. So you can actually tell different stories about how these different systems might evolve and do a sort of comprehensive cost benefit analysis to think about, you know, is one pathway more or less affordable for society than another? You can also do environmental calculations. You can work out all of the emissions coming from this system and do a sort of comprehensive accounting for those emissions and look at how those things change over time. And then I mentioned a few other sort of subsidiary things. You can look at externality values. You can factor in what are the damages associated with the emissions, or you can look at sort of things like health impacts. You know, what's some mortality associated with these different scenarios. So that's the sort of overall structure of the analysis. I'm just going to do a couple more slides, okay, Ubaid, and then I'll stop there. So this is like what LEAP looks like in practice. It's set up to, as much as possible, look like any sort of standard Windows software. So I mean, we've stolen as many design ideas as we can from other standard software just to try and make it sort of familiar to use. You can see LEAP itself is structured as a set of different views on an energy system. So there's like an analysis view, which is what you're looking at here. There's a results view, which is a very sort of way of looking at all the sort of results produced by LEAP in a fairly friendly system of charts and tables and maps. It's very much like using a pivot table in Excel. There's an energy balance view, which just produces standard format energy balances, very much like those produced by the IEA and other organizations, or most national national energy ministries will have a sort of job of producing their energy balance once per year. That's typically for historical data, but LEAP can actually show you what your energy balances in the future might look like under different sort of policy conditions. There's other standard things like sort of Sankey diagrams. You can look at marginal abatement cost curves, max. You can do decomposition analysis, which actually sort of helps you work out why scenarios are going in the directions they are going. You know, so how much of a emissions change is due to GDP growth, how much is due to the policies that you're putting in place. So that's kind of a decomposition analysis. So there's all sorts of different sort of charts and tables you can look at. This thing over here maybe is just worth a quick mention. So this is the tree structure in LEAP, and this is sort of like the fundamental basic data structure of LEAP. Everything is organized. All of the data you put into LEAP is sort of organized within this tree structure. So you can break things down into sort of the demands, which are typically broken down into sectors, subsectors, end uses, technologies, those kinds of things. You can look under transformation at the different sort of sectors like oil refining, electricity generation, and then you can get down into sort of the different detailed technologies, so the different types of power plants, those kinds of things. And then there's also branches down here looking at non-energy sector emissions as well. And then over here on the right, this is the place where you're putting the data in. So this is where, you know, for any given branch in the tree, there will be different variables. These tabs up here, the different variables, and then within that, you can specify the data associated with those variables. And you can see here, I won't explain exactly what it's doing, but you can just put data in by typing in numbers, or you can use these expressions. So it has a sort of like a data definition language that it understands. And you can use those expressions to describe how those numbers change over time. So it's very easy to put data in. You know, you can either type numbers in, you can actually link LEAP up to an Excel file that already has data in it. And the new version of LEAP even has something called the LCDS, the LEAP Cloud Data Server. So it's basically a big repository of data that lives on the web, and you can very easily pull that data into LEAP. And it has all sorts of information in it already. It has, for example, like population projections for every country, or urbanization projections, or GDP projections. You can pull those numbers into LEAP. It also has like all of the UN energy data, all of the World Bank, World Development Indicators. So all of the sort of stuff that's quite useful when doing energy modeling is already sort of lives on this website, and you can very quickly pull it into Leap. So anyway, those are the sort of things you can do with Leap. I haven't really got time to show that all to you. Here's just a very quick examples of some of the types of results that you can get out of Leap. You can see is all sorts you can get literally sort of tens of thousands of charts and tables out of Leap, depending on your needs. You know, you can look at sort of basic trends over time. You can look at detailed, here's one, for example, showing you sub-annual electricity demands and generation. So you can really get into the details, but you can also see the big picture in terms of things like Sankey diagrams or maps or marginal abatement cost curves. So there's all sorts of information you get out of it. I've already done that one. Let me just a couple more slides and then I'll stop. So just in terms of minimum hardware and software requirements, basically any basic PC can run Leap. It's not designed for a Mac, but you can run it on a Mac if you put Windows onto a Mac. But any basic PC should be able to run Leap. And in terms of how you get Leap, I think most of you have probably already downloaded it today, but you can download from the Leap website. You do need a username and a password to fully enable Leap. And I noticed a bunch of people today have been applying for Leap, but we could provide you with a code that you could share with everyone, which might make that a little bit easier. So maybe we could talk about that later on. Leap is available at no charge to non-profit academic and government institutions in low-income and middle-income countries, and also in most small island developing states. So for most of those groups, yes, you can use it for free. It's also available free to students worldwide. So it's not open source software, but it is free software for most users in low and middle income countries. We do charge a license fee to users in high income countries, and those license fees sort of help support the ongoing development and support of Leap. You can get technical support on the Leap website. There's a quite vibrant community of users on the website who try to help each other. So please do join the website and make use of that. And then there's also training available, but there's also a wealth of training materials available on the Leap website, but also on the Leap YouTube channel. So please do take advantage of those. I think I'm out of time, aren't I? So I should probably stop there. I could tell you so much more, but I'm afraid I've run out of time.
Yeah, Dilip. Thank you. Thank you so much, Charlie. That was so insightful and wonderful hearing directly from the developers. That's really interesting. I believe we have been getting some of questions before. I think what I'm going to do is kind of structure them and combine few of those and perhaps go in a more structured manner. So I think a couple of questions that we actually have received are around the initially, I'll be going in a structured manner, that what kind of license would be more appropriate for a corporate or a consultant office involved in professional modeling versus a university or any research institutions? And are there any limitations or conditions for non-commercial or academic users, especially in developing countries? And at the same time, there are a couple of more questions that are also linked on the very initial end. That is SEI or LEAP offering any of the training courses? I believe you have partly addressed that in some of your initial, your late interventions, the slide that you just kind of showed as well. And I believe a very linked question to it is also that in your perspective, that is perhaps a bit more technical, but in your perspective, are there any particular limitations of areas where we should not use LEAP for long-term planning? So yeah, perhaps we can start from these ones here.
Okay, well, in terms of licensing, yes, if you're a private for-profit company, then you do need to purchase a license. I think probably the easiest answer to all of those questions is have a look on the website where it describes the sort of the philosophy and the approach. There's also a page you can look at which has sort of the detailed terms and conditions. But basically, if you're an academic organization using LEAP for non-profit purposes in a lower middle income country, then yes, it's available for free. or if you're a non-profit, or if you're a government agency, same applies. It's available for free. So it's only if you're using it for sort of like as a for-profit organization that you need a license. But there's more details about all of that it's very transparent. If you look on the website, it'll explain it in further detail. What was the next question?
Sorry, around the training material, if there is anything online available.
Training material, yeah, there's loads of training material online. If you look on the LEAP website, there's a whole sort of book of training exercises which you can try yourselves. But built into LEAP also is a data set called Freedonia, which is sort of the sample data set, and a lot of the training exercises are oriented around that. So you can follow along, try the training exercises out. There's also YouTube videos of someone showing you how to do the training exercises. So if you get stuck, and they actually cross-link between them, as you're reading the training exercises, the PDF, it will say at the bottom of the page, if you'd like to see someone showing you how to do this bit, then click here, and it takes you sort of into the YouTube video where someone shows you how to do it. I think the training videos are maybe slightly out of date in that they're based on the 2020 version of LEAP, but they're still more or less correct. There might be one or two screens that look a bit different, but they're more or less correct. And then there's also on the LEAP YouTube channel, which is up there, there's loads and loads of other videos, some of which we've done, some of which other people have contributed. So there's quite a sort of rich knowledge base of videos, and we're sort of creating new videos all the time showing you how to use different aspects of it. So that's training. There was one other question. I forgot what it is.
Yes, another question that kind of falls in this category is perhaps when we're looking at the tool itself before going to the more technical sides, what basically differentiates LEAP from data software such as Stata or SPSS for these analysis and model building? I believe as for the first point that you mentioned around these different models, I did share with the training participants. But yeah, perhaps if you would initially like to give your thoughts on how LEAP kind of differentiates itself from more of like economic modeling or regression analysis tools.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the main difference is that LEAP is sort of specifically set up for thinking about energy systems and for thinking about the structure of energy systems and for doing scenario analysis as well, right? So it's very much set up for you can create scenarios very easily. You can compare scenarios. It knows about gigajoules. Stata and SPS they know about statistics and economics, but they don't know about gigajoules or gigawatt hours, right? So but that's the same with Excel, right? Excel doesn't know what a gigawatt hour is, but it doesn't. It doesn't know what a pollutant is. So it's more sort of topically specific, and it's sort of set up specifically to help you think about energy systems, and more than that, it's set up to know about sort of energy systems in low and middle income countries as well. So it has, it's specifically designed. It speaks the language of planners in those systems, right? I think that's the main difference, and that's also the main differentiation between things like LEAP and Times as well. Right? You can very quickly see when you look at Times that it's a tool developed by mathematicians who are interested in energy. It's not a tool developed for energy planners. It's a tool developed by mathematicians who so it's loads of equations in it. There's loads of mnemonics. There's loads of, but they're very powerful tools, but they're not trying to necessarily be super easy to use.
Exactly.
So
yeah, we do have a couple of colleagues in here who are working on the Times Marker as well. But now coming to the next category, I believe that is more combining the questions that are from the energy side of Pakistan. So, what is happening is that Pakistan currently is going through kind of this very decentralized uptake of renewable energy. So kind of to some of the questions around that, it says, how does LEAP handle off-grid or decentralized systems such as captive power plants in industries or rural mini-grids? And is there best practice for structuring such generation outside the main grid in the modeling framework, particularly in contexts like Pakistan, where off-grid capacity is growing rapidly? On the very same end, there's also another question that is more on the hydro power side, that is how hydropower demand can be forecasted in peak demand season and low demand season by integrating it with either WEAP or something else.
Yeah, it sounds like that person already knows the answer to that question. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those questions already depend not so much on Leap itself, but depend on the particular model that you might create with Leap, right? So it's certainly possible to look at on-grid, off-grid, and you'd probably want to set up, a module in Leap that looks at off-grid versus on-grid. Things that what Leap's quite strong on is the demand side modeling. So it's quite good at looking at, all of the details of demands. And a lot of these questions about sort of behind the meter renewable generation, which I know is like a really big deal in Pakistan at the moment. There's also, there was a very interesting article in The Economist talking about that, talking about Pakistan just a few months ago, about sort of the challenges of all of the off-grid renewable generation that's emerging and what stresses that's putting on the grid. So I know it's a topic that's very important in Pakistan. You can model some of that stuff quite well in Leap because it actually encourages you to get down into the details of the demand side of energy systems. So it's traditionally one of the things that models haven't been very good at, because they've been very supply oriented, right? They've been looking at, there's a lot of focus on modeling the central grid in great detail, but then not really paying very much attention to what's going to happen with demands. So what you've got is this emerging trend of all this new generation emerging behind the meter that isn't really part of the thinking of the forecast of the central grid. So you can do a quite good job on that in Leap. You can look at sort of what might be, what different industries might start building lots of solar generation, for example, and what's that's going to do to decreasing their demand for grid generation. So you can certainly look at those kinds of things, but it's really not so much about Leap has some capabilities to do that, but the main thing is how you design a Leap model. Make sure you do consider those issues when you're building your Leap model. In terms of hydropower, Leap itself doesn't have a lot of detail on hydropower. It's actually something we have been thinking of baking a bit more into Leap itself, actually looking at sort of, so you can sort of model the seasonal availability directly within Leap. But you can model those things by linking with water resource planning tools in particular. So there's a sister tool to Leap called WEEP, which is a water resource planning tool. And we do actually very detailed sort of energy water resource modeling. We've been doing that in a number of, we've been doing a lot in Central Asia recently, in the sort of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, places like that. Really very detailed modeling. And there you can get into not just looking at seasonal variations, but you can look at sort of climate scenarios and how over the long term, what might be the impact of different climate scenarios on water availability, what that does to your hydro availability, how is that then going to be connected into your energy system modeling. So we've tended to do those things at the moment by coupling two different models together. Leap and WEEP are very good at that because they have an API, so you can actually run the models in all sorts of different ways by, poking data into the models, running them, taking data out, results out of one model and poking it in as data into another model. So the API in Leap is very powerful for that. Did I answer that question?
Perfect.
I
Yeah,
think I
sure.
did. But...
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. That was really good and really to the point. And definitely, as Pakistan is going through the transitions kind of working. So just linking it to very much, I believe there's also a lot of debate or questions coming in around more of like, how does Leap account for any political or policy uncertainty when modeling baselines versus policy scenarios? And I believe it also links to the question that is posted by Zainab, that is, does Leap currently support any built-in methods for conducting Monte Carlo or probabilistic sensitivity analysis? And if it does not, how can users incorporate uncertainty into their scenario development? And are there any recommended external tools or workflows to integrate such analysis with the Leap outputs?
Yeah, it doesn't built in have uncertainty into it. It does in the sense that you can build scenarios, right? And you can do sensitivity analysis and scenarios. But for doing something like Monte Carlo analysis, usually what you want to do is actually have a sort of probability distribution on some of the input variables. And then, rather than running 10 scenarios that you think are
Mm,
interesting scenarios. You actually say, you know, there's a
mm,
probability on
yeah.
this, and then you want to sort of sample that probability and then run the model thousands of times, and then sort of look at the probability distribution of the outputs of Leap. So the way that we've done that up to now for Monte Carlo analysis is we've used an external tool, and then we've used Leap's API to actually sort of have that tool run Leap scenarios thousands of times. So it just sort of pokes numbers into Leap. You run a scenario, you collect up the answers, and I found Crystal Ball to be quite good for that. You do it's not free, unfortunately. You do have to buy it, but Crystal Ball is like a plug into Excel that does Monte Carlo analysis. But it's very easy to do that. In fact, I think I've even got a sample data set I could share with anyone who's interested, where you basically have a little table in Excel of the input variables, and then Crystal Ball samples those input variables and drives Leap, runs Leap thousands of times. It can even do something where it sort of it doesn't just run it 1,000 times, it runs it until it's confident in the answers, which is quite a nice feature. So Crystal Ball I think there's other ones as well. And I think you can even do it, if you're a bit more techy, you can just do it using Excel, but it's quite easy to do. At some point in the future, we have a sort of it's on our wish list to actually bake it into Leap, just to make it a bit easier to use, so they don't need to buy an external tool. But it's not so difficult to do that kind of thing, do that sort of sensitivity analysis with Leap. There's also this whole sort of school of thought about robust decision planning. And my colleagues in the water sector are very big into that idea. And that's same kind of idea, but essentially doing tens of thousands of scenarios and then making sense of all those scenarios and seeing which ones you think are more robust in terms of the variables you care about. But I kind of like Monte Carlo a bit more, because it's not sort of assuming that everything is equally possible. It's actually looking at the probability distributions of key variables. It can be hard to do it comprehensively because there's so many input variables, right? You can only do Monte Carlo with maybe a few dozen input variables. You can't really do it with every single variable in Leap. There's just too many. But so you can get overwhelmed by the uncertainty. But nevertheless, it's interesting, I think. I can see the hundreds of questions here, and I haven't got to hardly any of them. But if you could help me prioritize the debate, that would be great.
Definitely. No, I'm prioritizing, and we'll just be kind of taking just one or two more. Before going to some conclusions, but just perhaps one on that is more on the using of the software side. And I think I've been trying to address that question a lot during the whole day, that one of the major confusions they do face is in defining the activity levels using the terms, particularly the share or saturation. For example, percentage of households owning a certain appliance or the share of a transport mode. So if you have any elaborate on the appropriate use of the terms within Leap's bottom-up modeling approach, or is there any kind of a hand rule that we can follow just for our own understanding? Yeah, I believe that is something that comes a lot. Yeah.
Somewhere I think I have actually a slide that explains share versus saturation. Okay. I'm not sure if you've even got it on this slide deck, but somewhere or other I have that. No, I don't think I have it in this slide deck, unfortunately. Yeah, no, everyone gets confused about that. It's a difficult topic. Actually, this one isn't bad for that. So typically, share is when you've got two technologies that compete with each other. You can choose to use one technology or another, but the two technologies have to add up to 100%, right? So you, like here, for example, this is not a very good example. There's here under lighting, you can either have existing lighting or efficient lighting. You can either use CFL, or you can use incandescent, or you can use LED. Those three technologies have to add up to 100% in their market share. So if you know in your own brain that these things have to add up to 100%, then you should use share. Because basically, when you're using share in Leap, you're basically just telling Leap, please check that these add up to 100. And if they don't, when you do a calculation in Leap, it will stop and it will say, this doesn't add up to 100, please fix this. Whereas saturation is more when you've got things that don't have to add up to 100. And you can see that here. Here we've got a structure where we've got certain kinds of households. Some households have lighting, some households have refrigeration, some households have cooking. each of those individual numbers has to be between 0 and 100%. There's no reason those numbers have to add up to anything in particular, right? Everyone could have lighting, and most people have refrigeration, so it easily can add up to more than 100%. So in that case, you want to use saturation. So saturation is where an individual number has to be between 0 and 100, but across the neighboring branches, it doesn't have to add up to anything in particular. So this one's saturation, this one's share.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Just one last question, Charlie. After that, we'll move towards the conclusion. We're already since 10 minutes ago. The time that is coming up around is the scope of LEAP to be used for the financial and economic modeling, such as estimating investment cost, cost effectiveness of mitigation measures, or any marginal abatement curves. Is LEAP structured to do those analysis efficiently? Yeah, that's the summary of the question.
Yeah, you can certainly look at investment costs, investment requirements. And you can certainly do marginal abatement curves, and you can certainly look at the overall net present value of one scenario versus another. So you can get an idea from a social perspective of, does this make sense from the country's perspective as a whole? But I think it's important to remember this thing I was saying about how, even if a scenario makes sense for a country as a whole, that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual policies and measures are automatically going to be affordable for particular groups. So, you might have a technology that makes a lot of sense from a social national perspective for an industry, but it might be really difficult for that particular industry to do it. So that's kind of where other policies and measures might have to come in. You might have to say, it really makes sense that we should all have efficient air conditioners, but those efficient air conditioners cost a bit more than the standard ones, so we might need to subsidize them a bit so that households can afford them. So there's an additional, so there's a kind of an overall net present value calculation in LEAP, but there's also a new kind of affordability calculation where you can actually look at what's the structure of tariffs, and you can actually look at what will be the energy costs on households under different tariff structures and under different assumptions about the scenarios going forward. So like you could have your air conditioners in there, or you could have different cooking devices, and you could move to more efficient cooking devices that use different fuels, and you can see what does that do in terms of the cost burden on households or the cost burden on a particular industry. And then you can look at subsidies, which might help those things become more affordable for those particular marginalized groups. But actually, this isn't in there at the moment. In the next version of the affordability calculations, it will actually also report what are those subsidies going to cost you as a government. If you put those subsidies in place, what will be the burden on the government to find the money for those subsidies? So you can start to look at those kinds of issues. But I will say, just try not to talk too long here. Energy models, I don't think, are very well connected into thinking about the sort of climate finance planning. And it's something I'd really like to work on much more over the next couple of years, is to connect sort of the energy planning or the climate planning to the climate finance people. So that, there's all sorts of things about like de-risking renewables is like a really big topic, right? How can you lower the interest rates by the certain policies you can do? But I think there's a pressing need to better have the models better connected between the sort of issue of planning and finance, and that's something we'd like to work on more in the future.
Perfect.
So we've done some of it, but not as much as we should.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. That was really insightful. Really look forward if this is something that can come up, because that linkage would be really, really interesting for the case of many countries. But yeah, I believe as for the rest, I'll try to kind of answer them, particularly for the participants in the remaining sessions as we move along as well. But that was really insightful presentation as well. Thank you so much for responding to all the questions that might not, there might have been many towards the end. So yeah, I think just for kind of to nip down this first steps, we perhaps 2 months in advance, we might reach out to you for just perhaps half an hour to on some things around the optimization while be doing, because in the first cohort that we actually did, even the team that is giving the training, that also faced some of the challenges on the optimization side of the things when we actually started working on those. But just for today, just to kind of summarize, I was really, really interested, and thank you to you, and thank you to other colleagues for us asking these questions. Yeah, that was really insightful. But we'll definitely, for the participants that are registered in the second cohort, we'll definitely be discussing a lot of these with you during the as you move along with the second cohort for the next 6 to 7 weeks. But yes, thank you so much. But and once again, thank you so much, Charlie. That was really insightful, and that's exactly the reason why we wanted them to kind of have this one-time interaction with you as well, and just to again listening directly from someone who's working on the development of the lead. So if you have any final words that you would like to say to them, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a final question to you as well, Abaid, which is just, I don't know that when I hang up if I'm still going to be have access to the Q&A, because I'd be happy to try and answer some of the Q&A questions.
Yeah. What
But
I can do is
I'm not sure
perhaps
if
I
that's
can download
possible.
the chat. I can download the chat and send it to you later. Yeah.
Okay, that would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just finally, yeah, just thanks for having me. And I just want to wish you all good luck with your studies in the coming days and weeks. It's been a
Perfect.
pleasure.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much, Charlie, for taking the time out. And we really look forward to remaining connected with you. Again, I hope a lot of interesting ideas and models would be coming out of this training as well as other research areas of SCPI. We have been actively utilizing LEAP. So, yeah, once again, thank you so much for all the efforts. And thank you so much, everyone.
My
Goodbye.
pleasure. Bye for now.
Thank
Good
you.
luck, everyone.
Goodbye. Good day, everyone. Thank you.